Well, welcome everyone to the first semester 2012 Socialism, Capitalism debate. Thank you for all those who have come along today to witness what in the past has been intellectually stimulating, abusive, verbal battle over ideology. Back in 2008, we held a similar debate looking at communism and capitalism, just at the start of the global financial crisis. 4 years later, or roughly 4 years later, we've seen Australia come out relatively unscathed, but we've seen ongoing problems in America, as well as something crazy happening in the EU. So, with that in mind, should we be looking for an alternative economic system to capitalism? And that's what we hope to answer in this debate today. We hope to uncover the question or answer the question, has capitalism failed us? So just before we get into it, I just want to set out some house rules. First of all, if you're going to yell use out, please try to make it funny. 2, once the speaker's time has expired, please feel free to drown them out with cheering and clapping. And lastly, we hope you enjoy all the free food that's been put on today, but we just ask that you put your rubbish in the bin on your way out. Just so the speakers are aware and everyone in the audience is aware, there is a 5-minute limit. You'll receive 1 clap at 3 minutes, 2 claps at 4 minutes, and then we'll just start drowning you out with cheering at 5 minutes. We'll also have a different structure to the debate where we'll have a few questions taken in the middle of the debate, but of course there'll be opportunity at the end to ask further questions. So representing the capitalist side, we have the boys from the right side of the country when you're looking at Australia from space. We have Sam, Sebs and Vinay, while on the socialism side, we have Chad, Blair and Simon. I now invite a representative from the capitalist side to introduce their team.
Thanks, Angus. First of all, I just thought that we could get some definitions out of the way. It's always good for a debate to define what it is we're talking about. Capitalism is a system where the government does not interfere into the personal, social, or economic lives of its citizens. So this could be opposed to socialism or corporatism, such as what we have now, the corporatism where we have government intervention into our personal lives, whether it's on issues such as marriage, whether it's issues such as universities, whatever the issue is, they interfere. So you try and run a company and they'll interfere. You try and work for a company, they'll interfere. There's interference wherever you look. And what free market capitalists like myself are proponents of are is freedom of contract. So you're free to make contracts with whoever you want, as long as you're not aggressing against them or a third party. There's not really much more to say when defining capitalism. And I thought that I would end the intro after only talking for a few minutes, because it really does not take too long to present what capitalism is. I'll now give the floor to the socialist opponents of mine. Thanks for your time.
Well, g'day everybody. I believe that this introduction wasn't actually necessarily about defining the topic. It was more about introducing who we are and what we believe, or at least what we're interested in. My name is Simon Hukin. I'm a interested socialist. I'm particularly interested in the Frankfurt School and Habermas and those kind of things. I'm doing a Bachelor of Arts in Political Economy, one in Social Science, Philosophy. I've just finished a music degree and I'm also doing Psychology. Chad is doing his honours in political science, as is Blair. Chad's particularly interested in kind of neoclassical socialism, the more analytical side of things, and Blair is very interested in continental. So we span the divide there. He's a Zizekian and a Lacandian, so he's interested interested in the more esoteric side of things. And with that, I think we can continue with the debate.
So with those introductions out of the way, let's get into the nuts of the things, nuts and bolts of the things. So I invite opening remarks from the capitalists. Like they go first. No, the socialists. I thought the socialists were too. Socialists to go first.
So the topic is, has capitalism failed us? So I think we need some criteria to judge what failure might mean. So what we're saying is that a good economic system would essentially do three things. One, it would produce as much of the goods and services that people want and need. It's remarkable. Two, we believe it should do so at the lowest cost in material and labour, that is efficiently. I think that's unremarkable. And three, we believe that it should allow everybody in the economy to freely choose how to live their own lives. So you see, we have a lot of common ground here in our debate. We believe this is a pretty objective and unremarkable set of criteria to begin with. Now, what is capitalism? Well, we agree with our opponents that it's a system of free markets and free contracts, but with an added stipulation. We believe that the society in a capitalist system is characterised by the existence of two classes. There's one class in whose hands ownership of major productive assets, shipping lines, credit, all of those sorts of things, is highly concentrated. So one class owns basically all of the productive resources in society, and there's another class who more or less owns no productive resources. So they only have their labour power to sell. And that's most of us. It's true that workers own some shares, but it's negligible. When you look in the US, I think 1% of Americans own 75% of shares. Okay, the top 5% own as much wealth as the bottom 95%, and so on. You know the inequality statistics. So it turns out that this assumption is empirically robust. It's not as concentrated in Australia, but it's more or less true. We need to sell our labour if we want to have a decent life. So there's free market for capital and labour, in which we can freely exchange, at least on the surface, and we've got this asymmetric ownership of productive assets. How does this play out, and why is it that capitalism fails on the criteria that I just mentioned? Well, the way capitalism works is that the owners of the productive resources, who own all of the tools and materials, put machines to work, they hire workers, and we need to produce for the owners a surplus that is more than we need to basically keep ourselves going. And you all know that. If I pay you $20 an hour as an employer, you know that the only way I'm going to pay you $20 an hour is if in 1 hour you produce more than $20 worth of whatever it is you're producing. Then the profit constitutes the surplus, which I extract from you for no effort, over the total costs. With that surplus, I reinvest the surplus to replenish the tools and materials, to replace machines or whatever, to keep this process going. So you have accumulation over time, or if you like, in bourgeois parlance, you have economic growth. So, capitalism is based on growth. If we look at and you hear in the financial press, Obama says it, the benchmark is 3% compound growth annually. If you're doing really well, like China, it's 10% growth. If you're doing badly, 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, that's a recession. So the benchmark is about 3%. We need to put this into perspective. In 1750, the total value of all goods and services in the economy, global GDP, was $135 billion. In 1950, it was $4 trillion. In 2000, $30 trillion. Now it's $60 trillion. And in 2030, we'll be looking at $100 trillion. From that $100 trillion, what capitalism forces you to do is find $3 trillion, essentially, 3%, of profitable investment opportunities for capital to invest in. It was easy in 1750 to find that when capitalism was concentrated in places like Birmingham and Manchester, but actually now it's becoming increasingly difficult. What you're seeing is all of that surplus is being invested not in productive things that create jobs, in things that make useful things that we want and need, but in fact is being invested in what Karl Marx called fictitious capital. Ownership rights, securities, mortgage-backed securities of the financial crisis, the right to emit a metric ton of carbon dioxide. I understand many of you would like to support an emissions trading scheme. Great for bankers, can trade it like any other speculative asset until it crashes. So you've got all of this capital being poured into speculation. What this means is that you have a systemic imbalance. In the US, where this crisis originated, the bottom 40% of the income distribution has not had a real wage increase since 1979. Meanwhile, their productivity, how much they keep producing, has gone up exponentially. What this means is that you have an increasing surplus, which you're getting off the workers, investing it into further production. Now, eventually you get diminishing returns from this. It turns out that if you keep doing that, It's sort of less bang for your buck. So what are they doing? The capitalists are using the surplus and pouring it into speculation. This is very important because it demonstrates that capitalism is systematically unstable. All the capitalism pours into speculation. You get an increase in speculative activity followed by a crash as all bubbles burst when all of the exuberance turned out to be based on false premises, and then the system crashes, you have a period of downturn, and eventually an increase in capital stock. Boom, slump, boom, slump. This system has never been stable, like bourgeois economists proclaim.
And next up we have the capitalists to do their opening remarks.
Hi everyone. I'm kind of a misfit here because of my age. I've long since left university and I'm learning economics again after the GFC, the Austrian way, because I found out everything I learned was wrong, but now I'm learning the right way. And I'm here because it's an opportunity to tell you what the right way is, because this issue is an extremely profound and serious issue that is affecting the entire world today. And I've come here with a kind of a broken arm with the sling, because I said, oh, I can do this debate with one arm tied behind my back. So these two guys ended up breaking my arm. Somehow getting over the pain at the moment. This is the first statement our the Chad made was failure of capitalism. We need to define failure. In fact, what we need to define isn't failure, we need to define capitalism. And you might recall the kind of moral definition, the moral foundation that Sam outlined. The government doesn't interfere in the personal, economic, and social affairs of human beings. The foundation there is that the government fundamentally respects the rights that naturally occur among human beings and protects them. Now that's the theoretical exposition. At a practical level, I want to tell you what capitalism really is, because you're not going to find that out even in a macroeconomics PhD course at university here or anywhere else, except for a few parts in the world. You're definitely not going to find that out from the media. So please pay close attention. Firstly, I won't use any euphemisms. You will see kind of articles which say the monetary policy setting of the Reserve Bank was easing. And I would love to say one day, the Perth Now, West Australian newspaper say, the government yesterday, or the Reserve Bank, was manipulating the money supply and criminally bastardizing interest rates. That should be the headline, because that's what is actually happening.
Yeah.
And if you really, really want to find out what is happening, you have to throw away all your fear. It's true, fear is contagious. But I contend, and I submit to you, that courage is equally, if not more so, contagious. So be completely intransigent. Be completely uncompromising in your own investigations when you go home. So let me give you a few clues as to what a truly capitalist society looks like. Firstly, obviously, there are no price controls, and that includes price controls on credit. The price of credit is interest rate. Secondly, there's no malinvestment. There isn't a $45 billion project to serve broadband to the whole of Australia at the cost of $2 grand per man, woman, and child in Australia. Thirdly, and this is a hard concept, but go home and read about it, there are no fractional reserve banks. No central banking, no fractional reserve banks, no government malinvestments, and there are no lobbies. You go to K Street on Washington, D.C. today, the street is filled up with people who are ex-government bureaucrats earning $2, $3, $4 million a year. The guys who used to earn 150, 200 grand a year. Why? They're lobbies. The existence of lobbyists means there's crony capitalism, not pure capitalism. So those are your clues. And I'll quickly submit to you some of the myths and the real truths behind capitalism. Firstly, the GFC was not a product of capitalism, it was a product of government interference. In many, many ways, more than one. Secondly, the capitalist system is not subject to natural cycles of boom and bust. It is an intrinsically stable system. And booms and busts are caused by governments. And historic evidence is extremely clear on this. The government doesn't want you to know this. And lastly, you might have heard that Keynes rescued capitalism. And the Austrian school holds that Keynes was in fact not an economist at all. He was a fraud, he was a charlatan who simply wanted a whole bunch of politicians to listen to him. So he used mathematical equations to hide something that what he had written was profoundly wrong. He disobeys Say's law from the first page of his book. Remember those three myths, because there's many, many, many more, but time doesn't permit me to go into all of those. Be completely intransigent, be completely fearless, do not trust the newspaper. Trust your own intellect, trust your own reason.
Now I'd like the Socialists to reply.
Okay, we were going to have some sort of second speaker rebuttal, but I think we'll leave that for Simon. We'll approach what Say's law is and the validity of Maynard Keynes and what how pertinent the moral definition of capitalism is for the purpose of Marxism. None of those things really bear upon us. They're not really criticisms of a Marxist point of view or the Marxist school of thought. I'm here to just talk to you about alienation. And alienation is more or less the moral critique of the Marxist theory of capitalism. So obviously these guys have talked about the moral definition of capitalism, how it's all about free contracts and you shouldn't have government interference, and if people affect your will and force you to do things you don't want to do, that's against capitalism. It's what creates corporatism and crony capitalism and so on and so forth. I think I'll just make some preliminary remarks and say that people being forced to sell their labour in order to subsist, that doesn't seem to me like a free transaction. That's substantially not a free transaction. Formally speaking, it's free because you've signed a contract, you've signed away your rights on this piece of paper. Sure, it's formally free, but substantially speaking, it's not free. You yourself are not actually realising your full creative potential. And this is the point of the Marxist critique of capitalism and the point of alienation. The whole idea of alienation is that capitalism deprives people of the ability to realise their full creative potential. So there are four distinct points that Marx delineated, and I'm sorry for mentioning his name too much. You guys know, woo, Marx, I don't know. So there's four points that Marx made. The first one is you're alienated from yourself under the capitalist mode of production. You're alienated from others. He used the word species being, but we can take that we can take that broadly and just say from others. You're alienated from the actual work activity that you do, and you're alienated from the actual product that you create. So a very good example of how capitalism alienates people is the kind of production that the Apple Corporation and many different electronic corporations are now doing over in China. There's a monologuist called Mike Daisy, and people have accused him of putting things into his speeches that aren't true. But I think for the purpose of this debate, we can just treat this as like an a priori truth. Mike Daisy met a Chinese worker who made iPads. And he sat down in the mess hall, the kind of canteen that the workers get given. They're 10 minutes. They have to leave to go to the toilet in groups of 4, and if they're not, they're fired and brutalised by the police and so on and so forth. So they met in the mess hall, and he took out his iPad just because he wanted to write down the stuff that the Chinese worker was saying to him through his translator. And when the Chinese worker saw the iPad turn on, he said, "It's like magic. It's like absolute magic. Look at those crazy colours that are moving across the screen. All of these icons, all of these amazing images." That description or that meeting summarises alienation to the absolute point. And that is the worker who sits on the production line doing the same thing over and over. And don't be fooled. iPads are made completely by hand. There's absolutely no capital. There's only capital investment to the point that they use spaces, that they have to delineate spaces and make factories and actually have the space in which the worker is to work on and the tables and so forth. But there is practically no machinery involved in making iPads. People do it completely by hand, and people do it's like the Ford production line. And obviously this is where profits come from, by having people do one thing for a very low wage for a very long time. This idea of pushing people's work times out so that they create more value than it actually requires for them to subsist. So this summarises alienation absolutely succinctly. Someone who makes iPads has absolutely nothing to do with their actual cultural use. And so obviously the Apple Corporation has created this incredible culture out of Apple products. They've got these websites, they're distinctly white minimalist design. People have websites where they just discuss their iPads and iPods over and over again, and all these forums. You can see these forums like mactalk.net, all of these incredible forums for discussion. It's ridiculous. The underside of all of this is that you have workers who make these items who have absolutely nothing to do with that culture. And this is what alienation is. Alienation is people relating to things through their objects only and not actually between themselves. So let's say when you go to a bar, you don't say to your friends, all right, for this round of drinks, you're going to pay $16.75 and a half. You don't talk to your friends like that. You don't talk to your friends through commodities and quantities of value and stuff like that. So in a way, our family relation...
Come over, you've probably got a break and come over and get a seat. I mean, there's plenty around if you guys want to have a seat somewhere. Anyway, when everyone settles down, we'll have the capitalist reply. A bit of silence, please. Well, that last discussion was unfortunately divorced from reality. It brought up the the company which manufactures the iPad, being Foxconn. The national suicide rate of 100,000 people in China is about 17 per year. The suicide rate at Foxconn is 11. Now, suicide is a terrible thing, but I am sure those workers are gaining some sense of efficacy from working at that company. So it's great that we can criticise about alienation and all that stuff, but clearly Foxconn is doing something right. And I'm not the greatest defender of Foxconn, but the stats speak for themselves. It was brought up earlier on, the idea of class division. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, there was no such thing as the middle class. The middle class came about through productive means, through the creation of these fantastic consumable goods via the Industrial Revolution. But remember, the Industrial Revolution was not about creating things. It was about allowing man's mind to function freely. The Industrial Revolution is a misleading term. It should be called the Intellectual Revolution, because it allowed man to freely apply his or herself in the environment, and they created the monumental structures which we see around us. Everything in this building, everything in this room is a product of man's mind. It did not just spring out of the ground. It did not come about because some central planner, some commissar gave out orders of how to do things. And it is misleading to imply that. It's implying the implausible, that central planning works. It simply doesn't. It was mentioned rights. A right is a moral concept which sanctions and defines a man's freedom of action within a social context. As such, there is only one fundamental right, a man's right to his own life. All other rights are its consequence or corollaries of that fundamental. It doesn't mean that you have a right to medicine. It doesn't mean you have a right to healthcare. You don't have a right to education. How is it possible to have a right to the productive effort of other people? It simply isn't. There is no such dichotomy as human rights versus property rights. No human rights can exist without property rights. Since material goods are produced by the mind and effort of individual men and are needed to sustain his life, if the producer does not own the result of his effort, he does not own his life. To deny property rights means to turn men into property owned by the state. Whoever claims the right to redistribute the wealth produced by others is claiming the right to treat human beings as chattel. I take real exception to the idea that a right can grant you anything except the right to your own life and the consequences of maintaining your life. The GFC was brought up earlier on as some sort of flag to say that it's a failure of capitalism. Well, the GFC was a product of central planning. The Community Reinvestment Act of 1999 stipulated to all banks in the United States that they must guarantee certain loans to people other than prime, hence subprime. And so what happened?
these merchant banks got together and they started handing out subprime loans because it was stipulated in the law. Had they not, they wouldn't have been allowed to trade. So these banks, thanks to the moral hazard created by central planning, went ahead and created these mortgage-backed securities, these subprime loans. You had the central planners at the Federal Reserve lower interest rates again, I'm against all central planning and I'm not advocating they do the right thing in terms of lowering interest rates or moving interest rates at all, but they lowered interest rates to the rate below the level of inflation, forcing people to speculate because there's no ability, just because you put money in a bank and you think you're saving anything, if the rate of inflation is greater than that of the return, your purchasing power is being destroyed. And so what happened? You had people being encouraged to speculate by the government. You had the government subsidising it through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And what happened? Asset classes inflated. Well, you know, in all honesty, every single asset class on earth between 2000 and 2011 has gone up, except one, the dollar. And the dollar is the most regulated of all tools out there. There is no free market in money, not at all. And so we have seen a debasement of the dollar taken on by the bureaucrats, and of course asset prices are going to go up in dollar terms. So I think it is disingenuous to somehow link the GFC with freedom. Hopkins University, the two most regulated industries in the United States, banking and finance, and construction. If these are free markets, free of what? Government intervention. That's when you talk about free markets, free of government intervention. Yet for some reason, the GFC, the most regulated markets, were the ones which failed. And again, the bureaucrats point to the free market. Every time they use the word free market in a terrible sense,
now that we're midway through the debate, we thought we might just take some time for you guys to ask questions you may have. We'll just spend a couple of minutes on if any of you have some questions and then we'll dive back into it. Up the back.
You're saying that iPads are being produced in these horrible conditions. If there was no other way, should these iPads be produced at all, or should people have to go without iPads and iPods?
Yeah, this is something that a lot of people bring up. They say that, well, but if they weren't paid $2.70 per 2 hours, over in China, they wouldn't be paid anything at all. These people would be starving if we weren't exploiting them. I think we should be rejecting the alternative. The alternative to paying them shit amounts of money for iPads is not paying them anything at all. It's genuinely offering the entire world, and I guess this is where things get a bit hairy, genuinely offering the entire world a proper political and economic system that actually works. The alternative is not them starving, but us actually engaging with them economically in a way that is not alienating and that avoids avoids the contradictions of capital. So, no, we don't necessarily have to not have iPads in order to get rid of exploitation.
We'll just take one more.
Can any of the socialists actually name a single country in the history of man where socialism has actually worked without tyranny or genocide?
Well, it works wonderfully in Sweden. It's probably the closest model we've had to existing socialism. We have a very egalitarian distribution of income, a lot of investment planning, and also there have been plenty of developments in socialist theory which have incorporated the best features of capitalism, namely, the efficient properties of markets with investment planning. And so there's stuff called market socialism where you basically have investment centrally planned and then you allow firms which sort of equalise profit rates and prices on the free market. But the difference is the assets in society are publicly owned rather than that sort of asymmetric, highly unequal distribution which produces the contradictions that caused the crisis and will continue to do so increasingly severely in the future.
All right, with that in mind, we'll get back into it. Next up we have the capitalist reply.
I can go again.
Socialist reply.
We don't really care and aren't really interested in much of what they've had to say. It's not relevant to us and not to our argument at all. Capitalism requires by nature capitalists. It requires an exploitative class, a class which takes the surplus generated by workers for their own ends and their own investments. This is fairly ambiguous, fairly uncomplicated stuff. Whether or not there is government influence on the market this will always exist. And there has always been a class structure, whether it was in pre-capitalist times before the Industrial Revolution, there was the monarchy. And the monarchy and the lords, the feudal lords, they had control of most of the land and most of the productive assets, and their workers were exploited, and they socialised the surplus there. It just wasn't as great. Class division, as I said, has always existed. However, they claim that capitalism is a stable system. By nature, because of the fact that we have to keep reinvesting this surplus in order to continue to grow, which is a fundamental component of capitalism, it is unstable because you are creating fictitious capital, and fictitious capital means that there are bubbles, and bubbles always burst. Since the Great Depression, there have been 14 major downturns in the United States alone. Since the Great Depression, 278 bubbles have burst around the world. So, as a stable system by nature, I would say we have some fairly conclusive evidence that it isn't. We don't believe in central planning, so any questions about central planning, any central planning being offered by them, is not necessarily part of our case. We could go with central planning. We're open for debate. We haven't got a perfect model yet, but we are all interested in talking about it. The surplus, however, that is generated is often, in real terms, not the fictitious surplus, but the real surplus, is often unallocated. You have, say, actually a good example is the number of TVs sold, produced in 2011 and not sold, but thrown away, is enough to run all of the Olympic track events 500 times without going across a single TV, laying the track. We could in fact hold most of the Olympic events on wasted products, on products that are just thrown away, that are generated and that aren't used under our capitalist system. We have the Butter Mountain, down which you could hold, I'm fairly sure, some skiing events. You have the water skiing on the Wine Lake, which people keep complaining about in Europe. However, one of the big problems is that capitalism isn't very good at allocating things. The UN produces a report every year, which says pretty much the same thing. They update the numbers, but it suggests that you can cure poverty or eradicate poverty, and you can eradicate suffering and create infrastructure and educate people in the third world. You can lift every single person out of poverty for $80 billion. For an extra $40 billion, you can create the infrastructure and you can send them all to school with free university. This is a UN report, and we can bring it up if you'd like. However, what is advocated by these guys, if they actually desire a capitalist system, are better conditions for slaves. It's like, say, and for Keynesian economists, for social democrats, anyone who wants to reform capitalism to make it better, because I presume that's what you want to do rather than to make it worse, anything that advocates this is really like the slavery arguments, which wants to give people, gives people who are slaves better food, better conditions, better money. We advocate the abolition of slavery, the abolition of the capitalist system in this case. The capitalist system is like an old worn-out fridge. It's, you get your plumber in to look at your fridge and he says, well, yeah, I could replace the motor, I could keep it going with a stimulus or by freeing up the markets, but really it's cheaper and easier to get a new one. So we suggest that we turn towards socialism. We look at first a socialist Australia and then a socialist economy for the world. You talked about suicide in the factory. Correlation is not causation. And indeed, in countries which are rapidly capitalist, like the United States, the suicide rate is much higher than in other countries. So if you want to go along that path, we feel quite happy to contest you. But when we are looking at the idea of socialism, when we are looking at the socialist ideal, we propose a market system because we believe in efficiency. We believe in the idea of competition generating innovation, competition generating an efficient market. But we want to socialise the surplus. We want to take the money that generally goes to capitalists and put it back in the hands of workers, give them the right to operate their own firms, to think about how
Alright, so let's just get this out of the way now. We're talking about starvation was mentioned earlier on, how socialism creates this abundance, so no one will starve. Well, that's just factually incorrect. Now, if you want to evade the facts of reality, then sure, it works. There you go. But of course, if you want to be based in reality, it really doesn't. If, so 1918, the breadbasket of the world was Russia. They produced enough agricultural commodities to feed the world. And then we had the, the revolution in Russia, and we had all the central planning to come about. And all of a sudden, by 1922, they were receiving subsidies off the United States for food. Now, after 85 years of government planning, Russia was unable to solve the basic problem of feeding its population. Now, no man of authentic benevolence can evade or ignore such a horror on so great a scale. But of course, some people try to. In terms of lifting people out of poverty, the higher those skyscrapers in New York went, so too the standard of living. But of course, the factories of the Soviet Union, built on the blood and corpses of workers. Because, who is a worker? Everyone. Bill Gates works. He's a worker. But of course, these terms have no definition. Workers, the capitalist. And of course, if we're going to have an argument in which the definitions are just so loosely applied, it can be a little bit confusing and overall very frustrating. Of course, they mentioned that they don't like talking about central planning. The whole point of socialism is built on the premise that they know enough, that they know how to run your lives. And it's an impossibility. But the practicality is immaterial. It is the morality which is important. You are free by your nature as an individual. You are a rational being. You are not a slave. You're not to be toiled with by a commissar or a bureaucrat. And since you're free by your nature, it is patronising when someone stands up here and says, I know how to run your life if you just give up your liberty. And it's insulting. And I think as individuals, we should all look at that and take concern to it. Because this is our freedom which is on the line. And we definitely don't have capitalism today. We have a terrible mixture of freedom and servitude. And I guess as Hayek wrote, middle-of-the-road policies always lead to socialism. But remember, socialism, fascism, and communism, even though those two others haven't been mentioned, had the same philosophical premise, collectivism, that people can be put into categories. We should be rejecting collectivism because there's no such concept. At the end of the day, there is no such concept as men's rights, women's rights, black rights, white people's rights. There are only individual rights. Rights possessed by all men as individuals. If you create the concept that everyone has these categories, well, eventually we will just turn on each other as savages. The idea that individual rights can somehow be balanced with that of collectivized rights is a repugnant concept. It is simply not possible. Individual rights are the means of subordinating society to moral law. Again, I've mentioned that a right is a concept which defines and sanctions a man's freedom of action within a social context. But it actually does more. It bridges the morality of a man and limits society. That society cannot simply trample upon individual rights. The most profoundly revolutionary achievement of the United States of America in its infancy was the subordination of society to moral law. And that's one thing that we should be admiring the US Constitution in its initial form as doing. Because it ensured it was truly a revolution. Never before in history had the individual been supreme. And they built a brilliant structure of man's mind, being the US economy. But unfortunately, over the years, regulation has come through. But regulation is morally, philosophically, it is implying that you are your brother's keeper. As an individual, you are not your brother's keeper. Your life is your own to live, not to be trampled on by other people. I guess my parting words really is this: your freedom is too important to give up on grandiose schemes what the socialists are advocating. It's it's sad that we're on the road to servitude, and it's gotten to such a point.
And we have
just for closing up, I'm just going to ask both teams if you could just keep your closing remarks to 3 minutes, as we're going to be flooded with law students in a couple of minutes. So I now invite the Socialists to do their closing arguments.
well, our opponents have not gotten the definition of capitalism, so I guess I'll repeat it. It's a society in which there are two classes. There's an owning class and there's a non-owning class, and we've just told you that this is empirically robust. We've just told you that in the US, the top 1% own as much wealth, the top 5% own about as much wealth as the bottom 95%. It's a fact that 1% of individuals in America, 400 individuals in America, this comes from Merrill Lynch, the bank that tracks the wealthiest individuals in America, 400 individuals own as much wealth as the bottom 150 million, right? So that's the sort of concentration of wealth and income that you have in capitalist society. So I'm afraid to disappoint you, but you know, America does have more or less free markets and has got that class structure, so it is a capitalist society, and it's in a fifth year of a depression. They've claimed that it's a rational system, but we've said, well look, you've got 1/3 of industrial capacity in the US sitting idle, gathering rust and dust. You've got a real unemployment rate, once you take into account under and unemployed people, of 15%, which equates to about 25 million unemployed Americans. So you've got underutilised industrial capacity, all these people wanting to use it to produce wealth that could be used to produce you know, things to meet the needs of the population, but capitalism can't put them together. This is not a system of efficiency, of stability, and we've just demonstrated to you that this is a chaotic system. If you lived with a flatmate as chaotic as capitalism, you would have asked that they would have moved out or long ago, you know, sought professional help. But we still live in this system, and it's chaotic and it's inefficient. And it's inefficient because of the anarchy of production, because people are only interested in maximising their own individual profits. Now they're in a depression. Individual capitalists are saying, well, to survive and thrive, I've got to fire workers or, you know, reduce their income as low as possible. But of course, my labour cost is somebody else's labour income and consumption, which means workers don't, you know, haven't got the means to consume, so the economy depresses further. When you fire people, the economy depresses further. So this is an irrational system. It's an irrational system based on profit maximising capitalists doing what's best for them. Now, we don't endorse many aspects of the USSR. They seem obsessed with the USSR. What we're saying is, we believe in social control over the surplus. That is, the people who produce the surplus should be the ones who have influence over where they produce, what they produce, how they produce, and what to do with the surplus. Instead of investing it in speculation, investing it in useful things like a useful education system, or alleviating the 52 million people in America who lack any form of health coverage. This is what the surplus should be used towards. It shouldn't be used towards speculation, fictitious capital that doesn't create things that we need and that causes speculative crashes followed by periods of downturn with all of the irrational consequences I've just mentioned, followed eventually by an increase in capital stock, and then the sad old story again 10 years later, which is going to happen. So, therefore, it's irrational. It's failure.
I was very careful in my opening speech to define capitalism. Capitalism is the right to use your own body and what you mix your labour with to make your own property with other people. You own yourself, you own your labour. You can use it in whatever way you see fit, as long as it does not aggress against anyone else. The socialists are making a deeply, deeply utilitarian argument. There is this property, it should be used for this. Utilitarianism is based on an arbitrary system of value. This makes me happy, that makes you happy, it's all arbitrary. I might like playing basketball, you might like playing tennis. Does that mean one is better than the other? For me, this is better. For you, that's better. You can say the same thing about working conditions, you can say the same thing about whatever. So a Chinese worker working in this iPad factory, $2 an hour. Oh no, it's $2 an hour. Can that buy him a house, food, and a livelihood? Yes. Otherwise, he would find someone else. He or she would find somewhere else. The socialist side also mentioned that distribution of income should be as equal as possible. The USSR had the best Gini coefficient, which is what that is, in the history of the world. Yet they don't like it because it didn't work. And if something didn't work, it can't be socialist. Also, as we often said, in fact, each of us said repeatedly, what we have now is not capitalism. We have corporatism. We have government and business in cahoots. We don't want that. We want business, being business, acting on voluntary transactions only. Voluntarism. Voluntary transactions are the root of capitalism. Finally, I wanted to mention that they were saying that workers are being exploited. On a free market, there is no exploitation. That's a quote by Maury Roper. If I choose to sell my labour at $1 an hour, so that hopefully in 10 years I can get a promotion, I should be allowed to do that with my own body. Because I own myself, you do not own me. If you own me, that is slavery. Choosing what to do with other people's property, that is slavery. Precisely. And that is what socialism does.
So, into the end, we're not here to decide whether capitalism has failed or socialism will be a success. In the end, I thought that what we've done today is given you some thought-provoking thoughts to have.